This chapter's called Donuts and Dragon Fruit Crumble. I wonder if that gives us a clue as to why Thomas was rushing to his granddad's garden yesterday. My grandparents only live a couple of streets away, and I can cut through the park to get to their place. In fact, if they hadn't built the new houses at the bottom of our road, I'd have been able to see their house from my bedroom window. The reason they live quite so close is because when I was younger, I had this hole in my heart. Which sounds pretty weird, I know. I mean, what does that even look like? I always imagined being able to stare through it like my heart was a donut. But it wasn't actually like that. I mean, for one thing, there wasn't pink icing and sparkly hundreds and thousands and lining my insides like on a donut, which would at least have made up for stuff a bit. But I was pretty poorly when I was little, and so Nana and Grandad moved here to help look after me while Mum and Dad were at work. When I was about 5, I had to have an operation because the donut hole wasn't closing up like they'd hoped. When I heard the word operation, I thought it would be like that game where you have to fish things out with tweezers, and I couldn't stop worrying that I'd make this horrible buzzing noise and startle the doctor so much he'd fling my heart across the room. But he reassured me that he'd played that game for years and he'd never been buzzed, not once, so I let him do the operation for real, and he did a good job. But Mum and Dad still won't accept that it's mended now and I'm better. They still think I'm fragile and would like to put me in one of those giant plastic balls you can bounce around in at fairs to keep me safe. It's a good job Grandad's here. He's a firm believer in letting kids be kids. He says I need to be allowed to find stuff out for myself, even if sometimes that means I get a few bumps and scrapes. Like the time I showed him my design for roller skates after Mum and Dad had refused to get me some. It involved a lot of blue tack, sellotape and biros, but he let me build them anyway. It wasn't a total success, but I did learn how much the floor hurts when you hit it with your face, which is in itself an important lesson, so Grandad said. So like I say, I'm totally fine now, apart from being a teeny bit on the teeny side, and the doctor says I'll probably shoot up like a bean one day, but I'm still waiting for that. On the upside, it means that Nana and Grandad live only 2 minutes and 45 seconds away. On the downside, I can't help wondering if all that looking after me was what made Grandad poorly. Because now he has a funny heart, and not the funny ha-ha kind. Mum and Dad insist it's nothing to do with me, and Nana says it's more likely because of all the trifle and cheese he used to eat. But I still can't help thinking Grandad was supposed to be retired and taking it easy, not running around after me. I wasn't a patient. I didn't like being poorly, and sometimes when I watched my friends all playing footy and I wasn't allowed, I used to get really cross. I even remember shouting at Grandad and hiding from him on purpose, so he had to hunt for me for ages, which can't have been very nice or restful. But whenever I start to worry about him, he accuses me of sticking him in a giant plastic ball. So even though there'll always be this little raw bit deep down in my belly whenever I think of that, I keep it to myself. When I arrived that morning, I headed straight round the back. I could see Nana through the kitchen window, leaning over a huge saucepan, steam swirling up and around her. A sweet, fruity smell came floating out towards me. I gave her a wave and hurried down the garden, across the neat lawn, through the little group of apple and pear trees with their low, crooked branches, and on past the abandoned beehives, which Grandad has always promised to clean up, but he never has. And then I saw him in the far corner, spade poised, ready to tear up the roots of the dragon fruit tree. I shrieked and ran towards him. "Grandad, stop!" "Hey up, Chipstick. I hope you've brought your muscles," he said. "We need to shift this thing. Then we can start planning what's going where." He pointed his spade at the dangly cactus-like tentacles. "But Grandad," I panted, trying to catch my breath, "I found out what it is. It's a dragon fruit tree." I quickly stepped in front of his outstretched spade. "I looked it up last night." Grandad's face wrinkled. "Never heard of one of those." He angled the spade again, ready to do battle. "I thought I could look after it," I spluttered. "But it's taking up half the vegetable plot. We could get some nice beans in there. Wouldn't you prefer some nice beans?" I shook my head till I thought my brains would fall out, and then blurted out the only thing I could think of that might make him change his mind. Didn't you want some fancy fruit? Think of it, dragon fruit jam. You don't get many dragon fruit jam tarts, do you? Grandad rested on his spade and peered across at me. He was giving me his "What are you up to?" look, and then he winked and said, "Best tell Nana to prepare for some dragon fruit crumble as well then, hey?" He turned away and began battling with a bramble. I breathed a sigh of relief. Pulling open my pocket, I stared down at the little dragon curled up inside. His bright diamond eyes twinkled back up at me. For the next hour, Grandad had me hard at work. I'd left my hoodie with the little dragon in the pocket on a pile of dry grass cuttings. He'd seemed happy enough to stay curled up since the excitement at breakfast, but I couldn't help casting glances at it and smiling at the thought of what lay inside. I can't say I was all that heroic about the digging we were doing, but every time I started moaning, Grandad popped a caramel toffee into my mouth. We were just loading another wheelbarrow with tangled brambles when someone grunted. We both turned and saw a grim-looking man in faded blue dungarees wielding a hand fork like it was a lethal weapon. Here he is, doesn't look very happy. He was leaning across the wire fence that separated Grandad's garden from the one next door. "What do you think you're playing at?" he said, pointing at me. To be fair, I'm not sure he'd say this was playing, Grandad chuckled. Too right, I had blisters on my blisters from all the digging. "I've had vandals in my garden, you know," the man said. "Caused all sorts of mess. Kids mucking about in those fields think they can go anywhere they like, invading my garden. No respect anymore. I won't be having it. I'll be watching, and I'll be taking matters into my own hands the next time it happens." And he pointed a threatening finger at me, as if I were the one to blame. "Well, this here's my grandson, and he's doing me a great favour by clearing the garden with me," Grandad said, still friendly, but his voice was firm. "He's a good lad. He won't need watching." The man glared at me like he was waiting for me to show my true colours, and eventually growled, "You just keep away from what's mine, you hear?" I opened my mouth to speak, but Grandad popped in a toffee, so I couldn't get the words out. Then the man pointed his fork past us towards the ugly heap of debris we'd piled up from our digging. There was lots and lots of bongleweed. "You better not let that stuff get near my garden, blinking stuff. Once it takes a hold, you can never get rid of it. You won't get anything growing in there, not after that weed's dug its roots in." "Well, it's early days, but we'll get there," said Grandad, ignoring the old man's tone. He was like a chirpy robin, cheerfully making its nest on a Rottweiler's head. "Blooming disgrace, this," the man said, waving in the general direction of Grandad's garden, and he turned away, mumbling something else under his breath. "Who is that?" I asked. "That's our new neighbour. Moved in a month or so ago. Name's Jim." "Grim, more like it," I muttered. We watched him stomp off towards his shed, where he wrestled with the huge padlock. He slammed the door behind him, and for a second we saw his face at the window, glowering at us. Then a piece of ragged curtain was roughly pulled across. "Poor fella," Grandad said. "I bet he just sat on a bumblebee." That's something that always amazes me about Grandad. He's brilliant at dealing with people. Even if someone's being horrible, he doesn't let it bother him. Not like it always bothers me. Instead of feeling cross or being rude back, Grandad actually seems to stick up for them. "Poor blighter," he'll say. "Bet it was his birthday and everyone forgot." Me, I reckon some people are just like that. Rude, I mean. What was Grim's problem, pointing his bony finger at me, as if I'd go near his stupid garden? I was pretty sure it wasn't vandals either, at least not the kind he was thinking of, because I'd seen something that Grim hadn't. There were dragon fruits littering the ground around the tree. They'd burst open, leaving trails of messy pulp across the dirt. I counted them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 6 burst fruits. Did that really mean there were 6 tiny dragons hatched and on the loose? And if so, where were they now? As I walked home, I kept my hand in my pocket. I needed to feel the little dragon just to check that this was all truly happening. because everyone always says I have a great imagination, and it's true. I don't just daydream, I daydream in Technicolor with surround sound, so it could all have been wishful thinking, couldn't it? But as I walked, I felt my dragon's claws gently scraping my palm, and then I felt him curl up on my hand, coiling his tail around my wrist, and I knew this was no daydream. This was the real deal. I looked up at the clouds and imagined my dragon flying through the sky fully grown, soaring up into the blue, a jet of flame blazing from his mouth, me on his back. Inside my pocket, his hot breath warmed my skin, and with every puff the dream of flying flared brighter. But by the time I'd got home, I knew that dreams of flying would have to wait, because, let's face it, my dragon didn't even fill a shoebox. I wasn't going to get far on him, and as for jets of flame, well, the most he spluttered out was sparks, and that was mainly because he kept sneezing. He seemed to have a cold or be allergic to everything. As I climbed the stairs, the dragon popped his head out of my pocket and sneezed for the gazillionth time. Covering my hand with the end of my sleeve, I caught the glowing spark before it could singe the carpet. I was going to be an ace cricketer at this rate. I'd have the sharpest reflexes in the school. Safely in my bedroom, I lifted him out and settled him on my desk. He hopped about, inspecting things. I wondered what I was going to call him. Red? Scorch? Blaze? I tried them out, calling them to him. They were all good dragon names. None of them quite fit this little shimmering creature. Obviously unimpressed by any of the names so far, he flew over to my cheese plant and started nibbling at the few remaining leaves. When he'd eaten his fill, he fluttered up to my shoulder and curled his tail around my neck. His scales glimmered turquoise gold and back to ruby red, like a contented wave of colour flickering over his body. Now what would you call a dragon that looked like that? Try and think of some dragon names, and we'll find out next time what Thomas actually calls his dragon.